India's history, our culture, traditions and trade have been inextricably linked to travel through the ocean, the Indian Ocean, for thousands of years. We are in many senses the product of this flow of culture, as are other parts of South Asia, which have taken essential aspects of our civilization, our faith for example, and adopted it as their own. Now, despite this incredibly rich heritage, we often don't think of ourselves as a maritime state, rarely consider the critical importance of our geographic location within the Indian Ocean. We are a peninsular nation, profoundly so, but how often do we see ourselves as being a part of that? Now, in this book, The Incredible History of the Indian Ocean, Sanjeev Sanyal, who many would better know as the principal economic advisor to the government, offers a concise and easy-to-read account of this part of our history. It's meant for the younger reader, but really it's well worth reading for anyone interested in the subject. Sanjeev, great to have you on the program. Before we get into different aspects of the book, would you agree that as a nation, as a polity, we don't think of ourselves as a peninsular nation? We don't talk about the ocean. We tend to sort of blank out such an important part of our history, even though the oceans define, and the Indian Ocean specifically, who we are.
You're absolutely right, Vishnu. This is a real lacuna in our understanding of our history, because the fact is that by having this very continental, or I would argue Delhi-centric view of our history, what happens is that we end up thinking of the world as Pakistan on one side and China on the other side. Yeah. And that is the sum total of our geopolitical sort of location. Whereas if you think of our world in terms of a maritime history, and much of our history is indeed maritime, then it's a totally different view. Suddenly our neighbors are Indonesia and Singapore and Oman and East Africa, countries with which we have literally thousands of years of relationships, and mostly positive relationships of trade and exchange, cultural and material. And so I think this is something that we really need to think about. The book that you just mentioned, which is this The Incredible History of the Indian Ocean, this is actually a children's version of an earlier book called The Ocean of Churn. The idea here is to reorient our mental framework, so to speak, so that we can think of a much more maritime view of the world.
Yeah. Sanjeev, and it's not just, it's obviously the oceans are linked to our history, but at so many levels, culturally, racially, we are the product of the oceans and travels. And 30,000 years ago, when our planet looked very different from what it is, the continents were still forming in a different manner, we've had groups, tribes who are now such a valuable part of who we are and are residents of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Now, you've written about that and how ancient, an ancient equation with the ocean actually saved so many of these tribes in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands during the tsunami. And the reason I ask you this is because I've seen it myself in the case of the Shompen tribe in Great Nicobar. It's incredible, isn't it, how ancient tribes intrinsically linked to the oceans are very much a part of what we are.
You're absolutely right. I mean, the point is, if you look at our cultural memories, they are heavily oriented towards a maritime history. You mentioned a specific Andamanese tribe, which in fact ran up into the mountains when that big tsunami happened, because they had a cultural memory that when the earth shook, a large wave may come and kill you. So they ran up into the mountains and nothing much happened to some of these tribes, whereas modern facilities in many of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands got completely wiped out by the tsunami. But this point is more than just that. You see, if you look a little deeper into a lot of our culture, our civilizational memory, our festivals, for example, Bali Jatra in Odisha, very important festival. But what's it about? It's about the voyage to Bali in Indonesia. Yes. So it's not something that's happened somewhere out there. It's very much a part of our living experience, even to this day.
And that's actually my next question, that when we talk about who we are as a people and our cultural experiences and our traditions, our history, our trade, our geography, our architecture, It's actually gone from our peninsula to other parts of South Asia as well. And therefore, it's a collective sort of identity which has been, and the highway was the Indian Ocean.
Yes, and this is absolutely true. It's not just maritime, even by land routes. And the extent to which we are genetically a mixed group of people is quite astounding. And that's what genetics is now showing up. I mean, this whole idea of that there being, you know, a sort of, we are just the result of some invasions from the north west by some so-called Aryans is utter bunkum. You know, we have been interacting with the rest of the world, and a lot of that interaction, incidentally, is with the East, with the people that our tradition calls the Nagas. So if you do a genetic dig into a lot of us, we have a lot of Southeast Asian genes in our midst. Many of the languages, for example, the tribal languages like the Munda, are related to Cambodian. So these are migrations that happen from the East. And same thing is true throughout our Southeast Asia. You have, you know, major Chola port called Nagapatnam. What does it mean? It's the port of the Nagas. Who are the Nagas? Well, that's the ancient name by which we call the Southeast Asians. So there's a lot of interaction, and the same thing happens with the West, with the Arabs, the Romans, and so on.
Let's talk about the Harappa and Mohenjo-daro civilization. We've read about Lothal, we've read about Dholavira, we've read about how they set up that civilization on the banks of rivers, and all sorts of theories on why it ultimately disappeared. But how did trade during the time of the Harappan civilization really define a part of what we now call India? And where did that trade come from? How did that trade physically look like? What were some of the ships which were used? Who designed those ships?
So our information is patchy, but we do know enough about how this trade happened. But to know that, you have to first understand that the landscape you're dealing with is completely different from the one that you have today. Sea levels were higher. Saurashtra was an island. And what you now know as the Run of Kutch was it was the estuary of two major rivers. One of them was the Indus, and the other was a river that we now know as the Ghaggar, but was probably what the ancients called the Saraswati. So you had a very different landscape, and in that middle of that there was a major port called Dholavira, which is well inland today, but it was an island. From Dholavira and Lothal, these traders would set sail out towards Bahrain, Oman, and all the way through to Mesopotamia. And there are lots and lots of remains from that trade, whether it is Harappan seals, Harappan beads. You also have records in the Sumerian records of a people called the Meluhans, who came from the east and traded in ivory and peacocks and beads and so on, which are clearly Harappan products. So this business of Indians living in the Middle East is very, very old. We have been trading with them, and large groups of Indians have been living in the Middle East from at least the Bronze Age.
Sanjeev, so much of our maritime heritage, because of geographic changes, is literally submerged. An example of what was submerged and what emerged was at the Shore Temple in Mahabalipuram, again after the tsunami which we spoke about. What did that reveal?
Well, there have always been legends that there had been 7 temples in Mahabalipuram, but today we only have one set of temples on the shore, and there's another couple of groups of temples. But there's always been legends that there were these huge temples that went and were submerged by the sea. And nobody really believed these stories, because I thought, till, of course, the tsunami happened. But before the tsunami came in, the seas withdrew by a couple of kilometers, and suddenly people could see these stone structures, several hundred meters out in the sea. And since then, of course, we have done, naval divers have mapped it out. And there are indeed several large temple structures out in the sea, which were a part of old Mahabalipuram, which was the most important port during the Pallava period.
The Indian Ocean region has also seen, and we have seen some of the great travelers of history, Ibn Battuta, Marco Polo, and their cultural influences. But just the stories of their adventures across this massive ocean and on some of the land routes which were obviously used as well is incredible. These are some of our finest stories in our history.
You're right. So one of the funny things is, because of this very, first, a very terrestrial view of history, but of course the rise of China has meant that, Marco Polo's travels are entirely seen from the perspective of the trip he took through Central Asia and spent time in China. But in fact, he made his way back to Italy through the sea route, and he has actually left us a fair amount of stories about his visits to India as well. Unfortunately, completely ignored, not just by world history, but even by Indians, because of this peculiar orientation that we have. And that's true of Ibn Battuta as well. Ibn Battuta, of course, visited Delhi. Very many of us will read in our history books about his visits to Delhi. But he actually made his way down to the Malabar coast, and then he made his way to the Maldives, and has left us lots of interesting stories about his travels through the coastal India, which again, almost no Indian historian bothers to tell you about. So this is the problem. And by the way, this is not just true of these two travelers. Our own history, for example, how many of our NCERT textbooks tell us about, the queens Abakka, the three queens of Ullal, or about Kanoji Angre, who was the great admiral of the Marathas, or about Martanda Varma, who defeated the Dutch, or the Cholas, and so on. So the point is, our maritime history has basically been wiped out of our memory. And this is something that I have been pushing very hard to try and bring it back into our memory, because without that, we tend to end up having a very disbalanced view of history.
One of the projects which NDTV did, and which I actually personally did, was to look for shipwrecks off the coast of the Lakshadweep Islands. And we did that. Yes. The first generation of shipwrecks, many of which were beached, or some of them sank off Minicoy Island in particular. The travel of steamships across the Indian Ocean in a time period very different from what we've discussed so far has also had a huge say in transporting lakhs of people across the Asia-Pacific region. So from Australia, people came across to Ceylon, Sri Lanka now, and from there they went up to the Gulf of Aden. And so there was an entire decades of travel using steamships, which really defined India, our involvement in the First and Second World Wars, for example, and even prior to that.
You're, again, totally right about this, because, again, when we think of the Indian diaspora, our mental imagery is, again, taken up entirely by, recent diasporas have gone to the UK and the US, maybe to Australia and Singapore. But in fact, there's a much older diaspora, and I'm not going back to the ancient times, a much more recent but older diaspora, which went to Suriname and went to Mauritius, went to Vietnam. And this diaspora is still there in many, many places, very proudly Indian, by the way. I think, if I'm not wrong, the current Prime Minister of Guyana is of Indian origin. There's a large community of Indians in Fiji. We don't leverage these links. They have emotional and historical and cultural links with India. Unfortunately, this very land-based view has hobbled our entire sort of approach to the world. And what I'm trying to do through these books and talks and talking to you on NDTV is trying to drag people out, because it hobbles the way we interact with the world.
It does indeed. We spoke about China, passingly different historical references to China and trade. And there's so much between India and China through maritime trade as well. We can talk for hours on that. But now, today, the context of China in the Indian Ocean is very different. And if there ever was a time that we need to stop being insular about our geographical sort of thinking, as it were, and look at what China is doing in the Indian Ocean with bases in Djibouti, potential bases in Pakistan, the deployment of warships, nuclear assets, how is it not really the time now when we look at what the Indian Ocean means for our national security? It's not just the Himalayas or the desert in Pakistan.
totally critical. And incidentally, one of the points I make in my book is that India and China have been competing in the Indian Ocean region and in Southeast Asia for thousands of years. So this is not going to be the first time we will be competing for influence. Whether it's the period of the Cholas or even an earlier period with the Pallavas. But of course, the Chinese have been sending in fleets into the Indian Ocean region from at least the 15th century, when they send these huge treasure fleets under Admiral Zheng He. And so this has been going on for a long time. And let me say, we Indians have been a player in this game also for a long time. So we are not anadi khiladis in this either. But the present generation has at least got to know this history. And we've also got to know that the Malacca Straits have been a critical part of this history all this while. And the northern approach to the Malacca Straits has always been controlled by us Indians. And today it manifests itself in, of course, the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, which we control. So whether it is the Malacca Straits or any plans of building a sort of Suez Canal type to the Isthmus of Kra, it does not matter. The Andaman and Nicobar Islands are critical to whatever happens in that passage, maritime passage. And we've got to leverage it.
Yeah,
not to do that is to simply ignore our geography.
Yeah. And it's already happening now, which is why you've got the Straits of Lombok further south, which are so important in terms of access to the Indian Ocean by the Chinese Navy. Sanjeev, it's always a pleasure speaking to you. And, I have read through this book in the last 24 hours or so. And I think it's an incredible read. And thank you very much for chatting with me. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you, Vishnu. Thank you so much.